and welcome back to the Mountebank History of Scotland series, stroke podcast, whatever. This is my podcast all about Scotland's history. I'm Daniel. I'm a professional comedian who lives in Edinburgh in Scotland. I am also an academic historian. I got myself a wee master's degree in Scottish history. And today's episode is all about the Cromwellian rule of Scotland. This is a time when someone was running the country, someone was running Scotland, in charge of decisions here that nobody voted for and nobody consented to running the country. But of course, that sort of thing would never happen in 21st century Scotland. Thank God those days are behind us. After executing Charles I in January 1649, Oliver Cromwell, he hummed and hawed about whether or not he should accept the British crowns. Now, in the end, he opted not to take the crown and instead gave himself the far more modest title of Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Ireland and Scotland. It was a meaningless title with no real application or relevance in the real world, which, when you think about it, is actually the most royal thing that Cromwell could have done. Cromwell was famously a stern religious Puritan, and he placated the religious extremist minority in Scotland to help him rule the country. It's kind of like what Donald Trump does. Although actually, Cromwell was far more progressive than Donald Trump or the American Republican Party, because he actually had some restrictions on firearms, and he recognised that taxes were a necessary means of administering a country and maintaining law and order. Now, when Cromwell died in 1658, his son Richard replaced him as Lord Protector. But Richard, he turned out to be as useful a protector as Jerry and Kate McCann. And so the decision was taken to replace Cromwell Jr. with the monarchy that his father had worked so hard to remove. This made Richard Cromwell perhaps the most disappointing Nepo baby in British history, while simultaneously making the War of the Three Kingdoms one of the most pointless conflicts that's ever been fought. After 15 years of fighting, everything basically just went back to the way it was. It's kind of like the Americans' approach to dealing with the Taliban. Now, if this is the first time that you have listened to my podcast or you've watched the series, this is the sort of thing that you should expect. It's basically Scottish history with lots of Tory bashing and jokes about the royal family. If that sounds like your thing, you're going to enjoy it. If not, I don't know, maybe Neil Oliver's done something recently. Although, to be fair, if you're looking for a history series done by someone who actually has a degree in Scottish history, then yeah, Neil's not really your guy, to be honest with you. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the episode. Have fun out there, and I'll see you on the other side. Enjoy! The Cromwellian forces in Scotland were slow to consolidate on their victory at Dunbar. Cromwell, he became distracted by his godly work in Ireland, whereby he was basically just desperately trying to murder everyone. When it came to simultaneously murdering Irish people while suppressing the Scots, Margaret Thatcher, she turned out to be a far more adept multitasker. Now, while Cromwell delayed, Charles II, he marched a Scottish army south into England. And while Charles marched south, Cromwell's right-hand man, General George Monk, he swept up the remaining Scottish towns not under Cromwellian control, Stirling, Perth and Dundee. Just 4 days after Charles II's army crossed the border into England, Monk took Perth and he captured the Committee of Estates. The Committee of Estates was basically the commissioners who were running Scotland in lieu of the Scottish Parliament with Charles being down the road in England. And infamously, General Monk, he had the town of Dundee sacked and many of its inhabitants were slaughtered indiscriminately. Dundee, it was crowded with Scots who were fleeing the Cromwellian occupation of Scotland, and when the town governor refused to surrender to Monk, he ordered 2 days of artillery bombardment of the town, and he permitted his men to loot, rape and murder at will. It was the most violent encounter in the Scottish theatre of war during the War of the Three Kingdoms since Montrose's infamous sacking of Aberdeen in 1644. While Monk consolidated Cromwellian control of Scotland, Charles's army staged the fourth Scottish invasion of England throughout the War of the Three Kingdoms with predictably disastrous results. As Charles's army marched south, he was unable to recruit as many royalist supporters in the north of England as he had hoped, because there isn't nearly as much royalist support there as the Daily Mail would have you believe. Tired and despondent, the Scots army arrived in the Midlands town of Worcester in late August 1651, where they dug in defensive positions ready to defend the town from a Cromwellian force of around 28,000 who had tracked their progress south from Scotland. What followed was the Battle of Worcester, a battle that saw a long, curly-haired, eccentric man fight against a religious Puritan. It was like both sides of Russell Brand's split personality coming up against each other. On the 3rd of September 1651, the anniversary of Cromwell's spectacular victory at Dunbar, Charles II, he watched from the tower of the town's 14th century cathedral as Cromwell began his assault on the town. The fighting in Worcester, it would get saucy. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But Charles, he acquitted himself bravely in battle, leading a charge on Cromwell's right flank, which, if the experienced Scottish General David Leslie had supported him as commanded, would very likely have swung the battle in Charles's favour. Leslie, however, did not attack. Instead, he retreated, and Cromwell was able to recover and defend his flank. In fierce hand-to-hand battle, Cromwell breached the gates of the city and won another spectacular parliamentary victory, a victory which would mark the end of the royalist resistance in Britain. Worcester was the final nail in the coffin of royalist resistance. It was the last battle in the years of war across the three kingdoms, and Cromwell, he would refer to Worcester as his miraculous day. 2,000 Scots lay dead yet again, and another 9,000 were taken prisoner after Cromwell was able to successfully capture Blackpool. Worcester may have been Cromwell's miraculous day, but he did have one blot in his score sheet, and that was his inability to capture the king. After his defeat at Worcester, Charles spent a spectacular and famous 6 weeks as a fugitive on the run and in disguise before finally escaping to France on the 15th of October 1651. In order to escape, Charles, he rid himself of all of his fine clothes and jewellery. He shaved his long dark curly hair and went on the run disguised as Will Jones, moving between safe houses. Going on the run, of course, remains a traditional pastime of the royal family, although nowadays they prefer to use disguises such as man in Pizza Express or man incapable of sweating in order to evade the authorities. Most famously, Charles, he spent an evening in an oak tree in Boscobel Wood, hiding from Cromwell's soldiers who were scouring the area looking for him. King Charles, he hid in an oak tree. Prince Andrew, he hides from Operation U Tree. And Boris Johnson, he likes to hide in fridges. Charles was protected by England's Catholic and Royalist underground, because if you want to hide something, you go to the experts, don't you? He actually used many of the priest hides that were used by Catholic priests during the Cromwellian period of English history. So basically what was going on was the devout Protestants, they were desperately trying to find and kill the king to create a republic, whereas the Catholics, they were protecting him and the institution of the monarchy. Please, for the love of God, do not tell any Old Firm supporters who happen to be in your life this. I doubt that their little hearts could take it. And so much like in the hunt for Charles's great-nephew, Prince Charles, 95 years later, after his defeat at Culloden, nobody gave Charles up to the authorities despite the huge ransom on his head. Nobody betrayed King Charles. Except his son, who, badmouthed him in a tell-all autobiography that he wrote in Los Angeles. On the 14th of October, 1651, Charles made it to Brighton, where a local merchant was bribed and procured a Scottish coal boat from Pitt and Weem called the Surprise. And at 4 a.m. on the 15th of October 1651, Charles set sail for France. He would not return to British soil for 9 years, during which time he moved between various European courts, revelling in the retelling of his miraculous escape from Worcester and boasting about how he spent more time on the run than Liz Truss did as Prime Minister. Scotland, with the exception of the pestiferous burden of the wild Highlanders, was, after Worcester, under Cromwellian occupation. By the end of 1651, only one single outpost of royalist resistance held out against Cromwell, and that was Dunnottar Castle at Stonehaven, south of Aberdeen. Located on a rocky outpost jutting out into North Sea, Dunnottar was besieged for 8 months before finally surrendering to the Cromwellian forces in May 1652. Although, to be honest, waiting 8 months to get a result in Aberdeen, that's pretty standard stuff. That's par for the course. Dunnottar's determined resistance against the Cromwellian forces was a powerful representation of the last stand of Scottish nationhood, and it was made even more significant because of what was contained within the walls of Dunnottar Castle, perhaps the most significant symbol of Scottish nationhood, the Scottish crown jewels. After his coronation at Scone on New Year's Day 1651, Charles II had the Scottish regalia sent to Dunnottar Castle for their protection. The crown jewels, the regalia, they were under the protection of the hereditary keeper of the Scottish crown jewels, William Keith, the Earl Marshal. Keith was the official keeper of the crown jewels in much the same way that Camilla is the official fondler of the crown jewels. Both are very important symbolic royal positions. But William Keith, however, he had fought at the Battle of Worcester and he had been captured, and so he was locked up in the Tower of London. And so the protection of the Scottish crown jewels fell to the castle, the governor of Dunnottar Castle, George Ogilvy. If Cromwell was unable to get his hands on the Scottish king, he could still get his hands on the next best thing, and that is the Scottish crown jewels, the ultimate symbol of royal authority in Scotland. After turning down the English crown, Cromwell, he had taken the English regalia to cash converters, and he had similar designs for the Scottish crown jewels as well. Now, Cromwell, he was certain that the crown jewels had been moved to Dunnottar, and there are various stories of just how George Ogilvy was able to successfully smuggle the crown jewels out of Dunnottar Castle to safety. The most famous story involves a local minister and his wife. James Gardner, he was the minister of the nearby parish church at Kenneth. And his wife, Christian Granger, she was granted an audience with the governor's wife, the governor of Dunnottar Castle. And when Christian came out of Dunnottar Castle, she did so with the crown hidden underneath her skirt and the sword and sceptre of Scotland hidden in a basket of flax. Another version of this story claims that the Scottish regalia were placed in a basket and then lowered down the cliffs at Dunnottar Castle to a young lassie who was gathering seaweed on the shore. Regardless of which version of the story is true, we know that the crown jewels ended up at James Gardner's parish church at Kenneth, where he buried the crown under a slab in front of the altar and the sword and sceptre under the pews at the front of the church. There they remained undetected by Cromwell until the restoration of Charles II in 1660, where they were triumphantly returned to Edinburgh Castle, where they remain to this day. And thanks to the heroic actions taken to protect the Scottish crown jewels, they remain the oldest crown jewels in Britain and some of the oldest crown jewels in the world. They have, however, obviously not been used in the coronation of a Scottish monarch since Charles II at Scone in 1651. And that's because, just like our banknotes, the English won't accept our crown jewels as legitimate. The bastards! To conquer Scotland, Cromwell, he had to defeat both the royalists and the religious fanatics. And his impressive victories in Scotland meant that the kingdom was conquered for the first time since the 14th century. Scotland was incorporated into the Commonwealth of England via an Act of Parliament known as the Tender of Union. The Tender of Union was proclaimed at the Mercat Cross in Edinburgh on the 4th of February 1652. Scotland's 31 shires and 58 royal boroughs had little option but to accept this Tender of Union, although in Glasgow, a regiment of soldiers from the new model army had to be quartered in the city before the tender could be agreed. Representatives from Cromwell's religiously pure, purged Rump Parliament came north in early 1652 and they began the incorporation of Scotland's shires and boroughs into the English Parliament. Of Scotland's 89 parliamentary constituencies, 73 agreed to the tender, meaning Scotland had lost its parliament and was incorporated into the Westminster Parliament in London. Incorporation, it was the only feasible option for as long as a coronated Scottish king remained on the run in Europe. Peace with split royalist and republican states, it was never going to be achievable. unless, of course, they were competing at rugby. Scotland, it was permitted to have only 30 representatives in Parliament, half of which were English army officers, and its Privy Council was replaced with English appointed commissioners. Around 15 people out of 400 in the Parliament were Scottish, which is about the similar rate of enrolment that you expect to find at Edinburgh University. Local councillors, they were replaced with Cromwellian yes men, and the Scots had little to no power at Westminster. Thank God those days are behind us. Am I right, folks? Although, to be fair, these days we now have 57 MPs out of 650 at Westminster, which means 475 years after the military occupation of Scotland by Cromwell, we actually have less representation in Westminster. Now, that's what I call progress, folks. Basically, there was no Scots represented. It was like a World Cup. And those who did represent Scotland were simply expected to rubber stamp policies for the country which were directed by the Westminster Parliament in London and over which they had no control. These days, we just call them Scottish Labour. Cromwellian Britain was against hierarchy in church and government in any form. In Scotland, Cromwell wanted to smash the noble families who had organised the invasions of England in 1648 and 1651. Most of the Scottish aristocracy were forced into exile, imprisoned in England, or were fined and confiscated into obscurity. The diarist and Scottish Presbyterian minister, Robert Baillie, he played a key role in the rejection of the English prayer book in the 1630s in Scotland and the drafting of the Westminster Confession of Faith. And he kept details of key events during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, the Cromwellian incorporation of Scotland, and the Restoration in 1660. In 1658, he wrote, "Our noble families are almost gone. Lennox, he's little in Scotland unsold. Hamilton's estate is sold. The Gordons are gone, the Douglas is little better, Eglinton and Glencairn are on the point of breaking, most of our chief families are breaking." The incorporation of Scotland was then a disaster for Scotland's traditional noble families, as well as its church theocrats. Scotland was not to be run by the traditional figures who had controlled state and church in the kingdom for centuries. Instead, it was going to be run by this new, rising middle-class gentry. The Scottish kingdom, which had fought first for the removal of Anglican bishops imposed by Charles I, and then for the installation of Presbyterianism across the kingdoms, in the Cromwellian era, it was now expected to just remove all church hierarchy and accept independent worship of all kinds. In Cromwellian Scotland, religious toleration was granted to all those who serve and worship God in gospel ways, which is basically just code for everyone except Catholics. Meetings of local kirk sessions, they were permitted by Oliver Cromwell, which is just like kind of local church groups. But meetings of the General Assembly, this was where the hierarchy of the Presbyterian Church would meet to decide on church theocracy and governance. They were banned by Cromwell. Kirk sessions, incidentally, I think would be a great name for a porn star. Well, actually, if it's a local church group, he's more likely to be a dogger, I suppose. In July 1653, an illegal resolutioner meeting of the General Assembly, it was forcibly broken up by Cromwellian forces, and many of the leading Presbyterian ministers in Edinburgh, they were banished from the city for life. Now, the resolutioners, if you remember from last week's episode, they were the ones who, after the defeat at the Battle of Dunbar of the extreme Presbyterian Whigamores, the resolutioners, they were wanting to engage with Charles II. They wanted to work alongside him, and they were willing to make concessions on the National Covenant and Solemn League. So they were basically willing to not insist on Charles implementing Presbyterianism across all of his kingdoms. They were also willing to accept engagers and royalists back into the Scottish army. Now, their bitter rivals were the protesters, and the protesters would not accept any religious organisation in which they were not the majority, and they would not budge from their stance that Presbyterianism must be incorporated across all of the kingdoms by King Charles II as per their demands of the Solemn League and Westminster Confessions. Basically, as a covenanted Scottish king, Charles II had a necessity to implement Presbyterianism across all of his kingdoms, according to the protesters. And so they were bitter, bitter rivals, the resolutionists and the protesters. But both resolutioners and protesters felt that the religious toleration of Protestant independent Scotland's in Protestant independent churches in Cromwellian Scotland, so churches such as Baptists, Methodists, Quakers, it threatened the authority of the Presbyterian church in Scotland. I mean, it really is quite something when you think that Oliver fucking Cromwell is too tolerant. That's like thinking Nigel Farage isn't right-wing enough. Although, to be fair, believing an incredibly intolerant government is too tolerant is exactly how we ended up with the Reform Party in the first place. Despite the ultra-Presbyterian protesters being in the minority in Scotland, it was this group whom Cromwell favoured in Scotland. The protesters made up perhaps 20% of the minority, and despite the fact that they would not accept any form of church governance in which they were not the majority, and the fact that they were, at least technically, allied to Charles II, it was Cromwell who worked with this group to try and retain power in Scotland. So why did he do it? Well, Cromwell had seen for himself the power a united Presbyterian church could have in Scotland. At the time of the signing of the National Covenant in 1638 and the bishop wars that followed, the Presbyterian Church was incredibly united at this point. And in Scotland, they had shown the power that a united church could have and how that could also be reflected in military successes. And so Cromwell's strategy was basically to keep the protesters and the resolutionists arguing with each other to ensure that they didn't unite and then potentially overrun his occupation in Scotland. Now, Cromwell knew that the protesters may have been allied to Charles II, but it was a pragmatic arrangement with little enthusiasm for either on both sides. In truth, most protesters would rather work with Cromwellian England than with the resolutionists. The Presbyterians, they basically hated each other more than they ever did Catholics or Episcopalians, as was evident when they won their first league title in a while in 2021 and then celebrated by knocking lumps out of each other. There was only one serious royalist revolt during the Cromwellian occupation of Scotland, and it flared up in the Highlands, which was traditionally a Stuart stronghold. It flared up in August 1653, which coincided with the Anglo-Dutch War of 1652 to 1654. And so the rebellion created a very real fear in Westminster that a Dutch invasion of the British Isles could be launched from Scotland. The rebellion was led by the lowland aristocrat William Erne of Glencairn. Glencairn, he appointed General John Middleton, who had fought for the Covenanters, but then became an engager who fought at the Battle of Worcester and would later become a royalist as well. Middleton, he would be a really important factor or a really important character during the restoration of Charles II after 1660. He acted as Charles II's Scottish commissioner, and he basically ran Scotland on behalf of Charles II, but we'll get on to this in later episodes. Middleton, like I said, he had fought the Battle of Worcester, where he was captured, but he was able to escape his captivity from the Tower of London to return north and lead up this royalist rebellion. But the rebellion, it got a little bit of support from Charles II, who was obviously in exile abroad, but essentially it fizzled out after 18 months of mostly guerrilla tactics. The rebellion's failure was down mostly to the constant internal quarrelling of its leaders. The Highland chieftain Glengarry of the MacDonalds, he had bitter disputes with the rebellion's lowland leaders, Middleton and Glencairn, who were constantly quarrelling with themselves. Their inability to get along with each other was the key to their downfall, which is presumably why they allied with the Dutch, because they fucking love that shit. The rebellion, it was eventually put down when General George Monk defeated the royalist forces in an encounter at the Pass of Dalnaspidal in 1654. After the failure of the Glencairn rebellion, the Scots, for the most part, they acquiesced to Cromwellian rule and accepted their incorporation into the Cromwellian Commonwealth of England with begrudging resignation. Cromwellian Scotland was controlled through a series of strategic forts which were installed at key locations in Scotland. Cromwell built forts at Inverness, Inverlochy, Ayr, Leith, and Perth. And these forts, they were constructed at great cost and they were paid for by the Scots. The Scots had to pay for the forts that were occupying them. There was a sizable English occupying army in Scotland throughout the entirety of the Cromwellian occupation. At no point throughout the Cromwellian incorporation of Scotland did the number of English troops fall below 10,000 men. So there was a sizable English force in Scotland. And the Scots, they were expected to raise £6,000 a month to pay for their own occupation. £6,000 a month was sizable. That's like a Tory MP's cocaine budget for the month. Now, this was a tough ask with the country running at full prosperity, and it was one nigh on impossible in the depressed, war-torn economy of 1650 Scotland. Scotland's tax burden under Charles I was one of the key factors in bringing about the Covenanting rebellion that sparked the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. And at that time, it was around £17,000 per annum. Under the Cromwellian regime, it was at least double that. Although Scotland now benefited in the Cromwellian Commonwealth from free trade with England, that trade was always adjusted so that it exclusively benefited the English. So, for example, Scotland, despite being one of the largest energy producers in Europe, it was made to pay the highest energy costs in Europe after its own energy was sold back to it from London at hugely inflated costs by private companies who were paying dividends to their shareholders. I'm sorry, my apologies. I'm getting my centuries mixed up here again. In the 17th century, Scotland's largest export was wool, and its number one customer were the Dutch. But after the Cromwellian occupation of Scotland, the Scots were banned from trading with the Dutch because the English were at war with them. And so Scotland lost their number one trade partner. And furthermore, they were now expected to provide soldiers to fight the Dutch in the Anglo-Dutch Wars of 1652 to 1654. Scots, they were restricted from moving freely within their own kingdom. They had to produce papers to English soldiers, and they were banned from carrying firearms. So tensions, they were running quite high in Scotland in the 1650s. Scots, they were unable to move freely or trade freely with Europe at the behest of the English. Who could imagine such a thing? Am I right? In the lawless Highlands of Scotland, Cromwell learned after the Glencairn Rebellion to tolerate and deal with the clans, and peace was held both between the clans and between the clans and the English occupying forces. Cromwell built on the Stuart monarchy's strategy of allowing the clan chiefs to have autonomy and responsibility for the behaviour of their clansmen. But he also reinforced governmental authority with a significant investment in forts at either end of the Great Glen Way, at Inverlochy and Inverness. These forts were key to policing the Highlands and were perhaps the most strategically important of all of Cromwell's forts in Scotland. And so the Scots reluctantly acquiesced to the 6-year Cromwellian occupation of the country. They had little option but to do otherwise. Now, Cromwell, he was as talented an administrator as he was a military tactician, but the huge tax burden that was being placed on Scotland, along with the resentment of English troops being garrisoned on Scottish soil, it caused a lot of resentment in the country. So it was never more than begrudging acceptance of their situation. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. Now, the Cromwellian occupation of Scotland, it would prove to be pretty short-lived. On the 3rd of September 1658, Oliver Cromwell died. He died on the anniversary of his spectacular victories at Dunbar and Worcester. Cromwell had, throughout his reign, turned England into a genuine European powerhouse, and he started the beginnings of the British Empire. But right up until his death, no one was sure who was going to replace him as Lord Protector. Cromwell, he had not nominated a successor. On his deathbed, he finally nominated his son Richard as his successor. And this came as a surprise to Richard, who was a gentlemanly man, completely unequipped to rule through force and completely incapable of holding the Parliament together. Richard Cromwell, he was unqualified and brought up in unimaginable privilege. In 1659, that made him unsuitable for leading Westminster. These days, it's like a prerequisite. Within just a few months of being made Lord Protector, Richard Cromwell retired his position, and the English army leaders immediately broke apart and they quarrelled amongst themselves. It looked like the kingdoms were set once again to descend into a brutal, bloody civil war. Scotland's military governor, General George Monk, he felt that Cromwell's death meant the end of the Commonwealth, and the only sensible step that could be taken at this point was a return to the monarchy. Charles II's return, he felt, was inevitable. The death of the head of state meant the end of the Commonwealth, which, if we're honest, is really what should have happened when the Queen died. I mean, honestly, does anyone really care about the Commonwealth Games? Monk summoned his officers to Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh, and he marched his army, or his English army in Scotland, south into England to restore order and presumably make Britain great again. With around 7,000 men, Monk marched south, confident that he would face no resistance if he marched on Edinburgh. He crossed the border into England at Coldstream on New Year's Day 1660, intent on restoring the Stuart monarchy. Now, Monk had been, during the Cromwellian incorporation of Scotland, Cromwell's right-hand man in Scotland, one of his most trusted and important generals. But Monk had in fact started the civil war on the side of Charles I, and he only changed the parliamentarian side after his capture at the Battle of Nantwich in 1644. And when Monk took this affirmative royalist action from Scotland, it may have been from Scotland, but the Scots had nothing to do with it. It was the English occupying force, or the English occupying army in Scotland, who were marching down south to restore the monarchy. This was not a Scottish army. That's the point I'm making. The English had grown to dislike the presence of Scottish soldiers on English soil. It was an English army that was occupying Scotland now, marching south. The Scots remained, politically speaking, entirely inconsequential in the restoration of Charles II. Now, Monk, he used this army to dissolve the Cromwellian rump parliament. That is the parliament, the long parliament that had been purged of the ungodly and reduced to a rump parliament in the Pride's Purge of 1648. And so Monk, he restored something akin to the Long Parliament, and that Parliament voted to restore the monarchy that it had fought to remove, and the restoration of the son of the man that they had executed 11 years earlier. Perhaps this is where the utterly pointless ending of Game of Thrones got its inspiration from. And so, in May 1660, Charles II returned to London on a wave of popular opinion and fanfare in both England and Scotland. In both administrative and practical terms, Oliver Cromwell's attempt at an incorporating union was the most thorough attempt that had ever taken place in British history. But this was not a political union between Scotland and England. It was an occupation, a Cromwellian occupation of Scotland. It lacked the key ingredient necessary to create a nation state, and that is, of course, national consent. For a union between Scotland and England to be effective, Scottish people, they need to be allowed to have the durest form of religion available to them that will dictate to them how they can live their lives in the most miserable manner possible. And English people, well, they just need a monarch to worship. They absolutely love that. Now, the perfect mix of both of these aspects would eventually manifest itself not in the 1707 Act of Union, which was carried out without the consent of the majority of the Scottish people, but with the creation of Rangers Football Club, which perfectly was able to mix extreme Presbyterianism with hero worship of the monarchy. So much so, they've even got a saucy photograph of Charles up in their dressing room that gets them all riled up before they then go out and draw to St Mirren. The Cromwellian Commonwealth ultimately failed because it was led by a dick. And then when his son, Dick Cromwell, couldn't live up to his dictator of a dad, the whole thing just fell apart. It's probably what's going to happen with Donald Trump in a few years' time. In Scotland, Cromwell relied on a minority party to rule the country. He required a huge English occupying military force to keep the country pacified, and he taxed the nation at a level never seen before or since in Scotland. It meant that after his death, without the force of presence required to maintain the Commonwealth and the hard edges that were keeping Scotland within it, the Commonwealth was always destined to fall apart. And with no viable alternative to the system of monarchy that preceded it, it makes sense that the decision was taken to restore the monarchy. Monk was absolutely correct in his assertion that a return to the status quo was inevitable. popular opinion in Scotland was always with the reinstation of the monarchy and the return to power of the king who had been coronated in Scotland on New Year's Day in 1651. And it is Charles II's return to power that we shall talk about in the next episode of the Mountebank History of Scotland series. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode. I do hope that you enjoyed it. I'll put all my links to my Ko-fi and Buy Me a Coffee accounts if you'd like to contribute to the series. That's really massively appreciated. If you can tell your pals and get some subscribers to try and grow the YouTube channel, that'd be really, really good as well. You can check out the actual podcast version of this if you want. It's on Spotify and Apple and all that sort of stuff. Go and listen and rate and enjoy that. Give me a wee follow on social media at Mountebank Scotland on Instagram and TikTok. I do wee videos on Scottish history on there. And if you ever happen to find yourself in Edinburgh, you want to come on one of my walking tours, I do a comedy walking tour of Edinburgh where I take people around the city. I show them the sights, I try to make them laugh. I also do a comedy whiskey tasting as well. So you get 4 malt whiskies from Scotland. I talk you through the kind of history of whiskey distilling in Scotland and its kind of cultural relevance to Scotland. But anyway, I do hope that you enjoyed that wee episode there on the Cromwellian incorporation of Scotland into the Commonwealth of England. We're going to talk next week about Charles II's return to power, and I hope to see you all then. Thank you so much for watching. Cheerio! Bye-bye!